Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. And every Wednesday, I talk with journalists about the important stories that they're covering for my show, First Draft. And joining me today is Antonia Hylton. She is a Peabody and Emmy Award-winning journalist. She is the co-anchor of MSNBC's Weekend Primetime. And she also was the co-host of hit podcast Southlake and Grapevine. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling book Madness, Race and Insanity in the Jim Crow Asylum, and that is now available on paperback. Thank you so much for joining us, Antonia.
Thank you for having me, Susan. I'm so excited to be part of this.
Great. I'm really excited to talk with you about your book, but I had to ask you about the news of the day, the story that we're all covering, which is the federal government shutdown. So I was just wondering if you could talk with us a little bit about why this happened and how it's going to impact people, some of the things that you'll be covering.
Yeah, we, on our weekend show, spent the entire weekend sort of counting down to this shutdown. And so I think for people who've been watching this closely, they're not so surprised that we got to this point. I know that people are always incredibly nervous when there's a shutdown, of course, because they're worried about what services may be lost or impacted, whether that's what they're going to experience at the airport, the delivery of crucial healthcare services, and their concerns for their loved ones, because so many people are connected to federal workers who may be directly impacted by this and not receiving their paychecks until all of this comes to an end. And as with any past shutdown, those dynamics are the same at play here. I think what's been incredibly frustrating as a reporter covering the lead up to the shutdown has been the extent to which there's just been this like basic battle over dis and misinformation spread primarily from the president and many of the Republicans, arguing that this was a shutdown about Democrats trying to provide free health care to undocumented immigrants, when that's something that's simply not possible through federal law. It's really not even something Democrats could necessarily change at this time if they even wanted to. But they have been highly concerned about access to healthcare subsidies, and elements of Obamacare for people, regular, everyday Americans, millions of people who will be impacted by losses. And open enrollment is coming November 1. And so I think, as you've heard a lot of the Democrats try to explain to voters, to citizens watching all of this unfold, they really have been put in as a party in this position of trying to figure out what's standing up to this administration, both on sort of the messaging and the story the president has told about what this is all about, how they push back against this, but also what it means to stand up for voters at this time, whether that means keeping the government open and collaborating with Republicans, or that actually means sort of not being the first to blink, and taking the opportunity of the shutdown to sort of show the level of dysfunction that's in our federal system at this time, and talk to voters about all of that. And so I'm going to be looking for a few things. Of course, the impacts on everyday people who are experiencing the fallout from a shutdown, but also sort of the narrative battle that we're already seeing take shape. How both Republicans and Democrats are going to be able to communicate this to their constituents, who ends up bearing the burden and the blame for it, and sort of how it shifts our national dialogue. And then, of course, we're hearing from President Trump that Republicans are hoping to use this as an opportunity to potentially do mass layoffs. So those are the people we're going to need to reach out to give the opportunity to speak, to tell stories about. We'll be keeping an eye on all of those elements as this drags on, Susan.
Great. This is certainly a story that we'll be covering for a while, it looks like, because it doesn't seem like a deal is anywhere in the offing. Typically, when we see a government shutdown situation, whether it's at the state or federal level, it's at a time of divided government and the parties can't get together. So it's a little bit different because Republicans, of course, are in charge of Congress and we have a Republican president. But we did have the longest government shutdown during Donald Trump's first term. It was 35 days spanning from December 2018 to January of 2019. How long are you hearing from experts that they're expecting that this shutdown may last?
To be honest with you, it's all over the map, at least for me. I could check with some of my colleagues who spend their days in and out of the halls of Capitol Hill
Right,
and sort of harassing these members of Congress themselves.
right.
But some of the experts I spoke to this weekend actually were hoping we would not get to this point at all.
Mhm.
And we had some interesting debates about that. And clearly we now see where we are. And then others think that it's possible that this one could drag on for quite a while. I think it really will depend in part on the obviously the behind the scenes negotiations that happen here, but also how the American public sort of reacts to this moment
Mm.
and where the conversation goes. I think that's going to be really cool right now. And so that's why the sort of narrative and storytelling around what this represents is important. And what you pointed out, I think is going to be something you're going to hear Democrats say a lot, which is this dysfunction is a direct result of a party that controls everything at the moment.
Mm.
We're in the minority. And if they're unable to get this done, that's fundamentally on them. Whether voters are going to buy that or not is a different question.
Right, right. Well, turning to your book, Madness, which you chronicle an institution called Crownsville, which was known by the name Hospital for the Negro Insane of Maryland. So that just gives us a window into,
Right.
I think, a time period, a world that a lot of us aren't very familiar with, which is why it's important to tell these stories. But I thought it was interesting how you tie this to present day struggles, how Black Americans for generations have struggled to voice concerns about mental health and to access mental health resources. And that's still going on today. And I know you said in a previous interview that you feel like there's a revival of the same culture in today's America that dehumanizes and criminalizes the homeless and those struggling with mental illness. So I was wondering if we could start there and you could talk
Yeah.
with us a little bit more about that.
Of course, I think we're in this sort of strange full circle moment, and I'm grateful to have done this work and to be able to share it and talk with people about it. And then also, I'm sometimes saddened by the sort of repeat patterns that I'm going, this reminds me of comments that I read that a politician made back in 1910 or 1911 at the the creation of this institution that I studied. Crownsville is actually still stands to this day in the heart of Anne Arundel County, Maryland. It's right outside of Annapolis. And it was born in the early 1900s, basically after decades of debate after slavery ended about sort of what to do with Black people who seemed to struggle to adjust to everyday life. And there were doctors and politicians and business owners sort of arguing what they described to be sort of wayward, homeless, lost Black people who, I think it's easy for us to look back now and say, well, clearly they were suffering and traumatized after hundreds of years of slavery and sort of struggling to find their way forward. But at the time, there was this sort of expectation that they should have just had it figured out and that something must be wrong with them, or perhaps slavery had actually been a good thing because, well, we didn't see this when those were the conditions.
Mhm.
And it's interesting, I think, now in this political moment to see, like, after slavery ends and Reconstruction, and then there's a pendulum swinging movement to sort of take back civil rights and financial and communal gains that the Black community made in that period in the country, and look at what's happening in this very reactionary moment that we're all living in now. And one of the patterns that I've been pointing out to people that's really common, that tells you a lot about perhaps a slide toward authoritarianism, a sort of a callousness being baked into your society, is the way in which people talk about the most destitute among us, the most vulnerable people among us, people who depend on shelters, or back then they would have been called almshouses, or who were vulnerable to being picked up by authorities in the middle of the night simply because they didn't really have somewhere to be or to go. And both in our current moment and in the period in which I studied for the creation of Crownsville, you see this really nasty rhetoric spread, and this sort of push to blame a lot of social ills or to solve social ills by villainizing really vulnerable people. And I think we're seeing that right now. I think we've seen it. I'm in Washington, D.C. for work right now. The National Guard deployment here, the president speaking about homeless people in ways that many would describe as very callous, sort of seeming disinterested in whether or not they end up in mental health care programs or with housing or simply just sent to jails to get out of the way. But it seems like getting them out of the way is the top priority. We're also seeing this happen in other states. The governor of Oklahoma making a big push to move homeless people out of sort of public view, public encampments without much in the way of mental health or community services being offered to them. And then, we saw a host on Fox News just a couple weeks ago make remarks about the sort of possibility of using involuntary lethal injections on large numbers of homeless people in the United States. Of course, that shocked a lot of people, but not to the point at which that person seems to have really suffered any, career repercussions. And that moment really stuck with me because of the kind of rhetoric I had read in the period of this story that I tell in Madness. Just that out of this system of the pendulum swinging back, people trying to strip a group of Americans of their civil rights, and the creation of Jim Crow, the separation of care, and these black and white system where black only segregated asylum is created in the woods in Maryland in this period. I started to see all these patterns and similarities that really alarmed me. But I guess on the good side, the flip side is that history tells us a lot also about how you get out of these moments or who the people are who guide us out of these moments. And so there's the fear that comes with this kind of work, but also I guess the roadmap that you can see through it too.
Right. And we definitely have seen more violent rhetoric about people who are homeless and, other marginalized groups, and, not just coming from folks on the internet, but actually elected officials, actually the president of the United States. And as you pointed out, that was kind of his reason for why the National Guard had to move into Washington, D.C., was that he was seeing homeless people on his route to go to his golf course, and something had to be done. And then that's become a blueprint for him, threatening to send troops into Chicago, saying he's going to send troops into Memphis and Portland. Where do you see this? Where do you see the policy of the Trump administration going in terms of the homeless, in terms of just African Americans writ large?
Well, for the homeless population, which of course is disproportionately people of color, not just African Americans, but all kinds of Americans, I worry that we're really turning the clock back. The other thing we've seen in the rhetoric, and this didn't just start in the last few months, I've seen it over the last couple of years, is a push to sort of reopen the asylums, to warehouse people at any cost again. A comfort with using jails as an appendage of the mental health care system, which has frankly been going on for quite a while anyway. There's a lot of people.
There has been a movement against that with like mental health courts and drug courts. So people get help that they need instead of just throwing them in jail. So we seem to be winding that back.
Some people are very open about the fact they want to wind that back. And then look, when you see healthcare cuts devastating communities across the country, that has a very direct impact on mental health care too. A lot of Americans get mental health care in emergency rooms. If they live in rural communities, they depend on the ability to go into an emergency room to get connected to care, to solve a crisis. And a lot of rural hospitals are going to be minimizing the care that they're able to offer, or really having to focus on people who are in the most acute crises. And people struggling with mental health challenges might not always be seen as being the most deserving of that emergency care. And so I think that actually what we're seeing is that the situation is going to get worse. They're claiming that they want to solve the challenge of homelessness, that they want these people out of public view. They go get help somewhere, go get help. But they're actually cutting funding for all the things that would give them help, cutting the beds where they could sleep at night. And so without actually a massive sort of national level reinvestment in mental health care and a reconstruction of beds and new funds for the programs, drug recovery programs, veterans housing, all of these kinds of things, they make up the many faces of the mental health care system. Without that, you're actually going to make this problem worse and worse and worse. And so the administration seems to be saying they want one thing, but they're doing everything to actually put us in the opposite position in place to rapidly make these conditions worse. And my fear is that then a lot of people are going to end up criminalized. They're going to end up behind bars. And instead of getting cared for as patients, they'll be treated as prisoners instead, Susan.
And, this is a complicated issue. There's not an easy solution that nobody has tried, and it's often, expensive, and it's not something that, you can just fix with rhetoric or moving people out of public view. And so there's this danger in offering up these simple solutions that also have a fundamental lack of empathy, it seems to me. And plus, we're in a time where there has been a real acknowledgement of a mental health crisis, especially since the pandemic, where more and more people are suffering and need help. And again, it's not an easy problem for people to fix, especially if you don't have health insurance, which a growing number of Americans don't. And so it doesn't seem to me that this is really a policy prescription about how to solve the problem, but more in terms of political rhetoric and just an overall agenda.
Performance.
Yes. And there's been a disinvestment in our people infrastructure as well, which, would be necessary if you really wanted to solve the issues. And to me, this seems part of a pattern of scapegoating certain people, especially folks that may not engender as much sympathy, which, you see with Trump's attacks on illegal immigrants, but also, the mentally ill. A lot of people don't have as much sympathy, for people who are there homeless on the street. And if you attack a group that's not as popular, it seems that we know from history that there's a pattern of a slippery slope where it makes it easier to start, attacking other people as well.
Yeah, and I can tell you, one of the things that I write about at the beginning of my book is actually my family's personal experience. I wrote this book during the pandemic, and I had a loved one going through psychosis at the time. So an incredibly serious mental health crisis. And the strange thing about going through that with a family member is that you feel really, really alone, even though there are a lot of Americans who are actually related to people who go through this. And I have a great job at MSNBC. I have good health insurance. I'm a journalist. I know how to get on the phone and hold people accountable and ask lots of good questions. And for me and my siblings and my family, this was just a sort of earth-shattering experience. It took us months to get our loved one into a program for care. So months of phone calls. And when months go by while someone is experiencing something like this, they're at risk of losing their housing, because when you are experiencing a crisis of that kind, you don't pay your rent. Right. You barely remember to eat food. Sometimes we would go days or weeks without knowing where my loved one was. They had interactions with police officers that were really frightening to my family. I had to have a conversation at one point with a police officer, asking them to keep an eye on my loved one and promise to not shoot them if they saw them, and, gave them my personal cell phone number and said, hey, if they're causing a problem, please call me before, it escalates. And my family had the resources, the time, the number of people to collaborate and to get this done and to keep them safe. But many families don't have that. And we were struggling, and we have resources. I have good healthcare. My loved one had healthcare, and we still almost couldn't get it done. And so it really broke my heart just knowing that if you had even just a little less than what I had, or you have no health care in this country at all, this is impossible for you. And then when we finally did get my loved one into a good mental health care treatment program, the cost when they got out was exorbitant. I mean, just shocking, even with, their health insurance covering a lot of it. Again, thankfully, I come from a big family, which means a lot of that was that cost was shared. But a lot of people can't do that. They're not going to be able to pay that bill. They're not going to be able to send their loved one to I remember interviewing people who were trying to get their loved ones into certain drug recovery programs and being told it would cost them tens of thousands of dollars. That's just not an option.
Right.
And so many people, I think one of the mistakes actually that politicians are making when they push a lot of this rhetoric is they think nobody knows these people. But actually many people are connected to someone who is going through a mental health crisis and who is at risk, say if they just had a little bit less support or some crisis happened at their job or they got fired, who would not be able to pay their rent next month, who maybe could become vulnerable in terms of housing. And so I think there are more of us connected to these people than they believe there are. It's just we're very isolated. We don't know. There's a shame baked into it. So you don't go hang out with a friend at the bar and say, this is what's going on with my family. and wow, I'm pretty panicked about what I'm going to be able to do. A lot of people keep this stuff to themselves and they're hurt, they're worried, they're embarrassed, or they're trying to keep secrets on someone's behalf. And so there's not that connection, that community. And so people don't see us as a constituency that deserves respect or support or that they have to answer to. And I wish there was a little bit more of that sense of community there, because I think there's a lot more of us. There are millions and millions of Americans that go through what my family went through. And I wish we had a better way of finding each other sometimes, because then I think maybe politicians would treat all of us with a little bit more respect.
Right. And obviously there is, still a stigma with mental health issues. And I know you have talked about how that has particularly manifested itself in the African-American community. I was wondering if you could talk with us a little bit about that and the historic roots.
For decades, it's almost been a joke or sort of a stereotype in both Black communities and immigrant communities in the US that they view sort of any kind of mental health care, meeting with a psychiatrist, a therapist, as something that's really just for white people, that is designed to harm them. I have family members who, when I was growing up, believed that it was dangerous to do therapy, dangerous to try a medication if you were depressed, that you really couldn't trust these doctors or these therapists to give you good advice and honest advice if you were a person of color or an immigrant. And I come from a family that's both half Black American, my father's family enslaved in the country for hundreds of years, my mom Afro-Cuban. So my mom is first generation. So she very much comes from sort of the immigrant perspective on a lot of this. And so I grew up hearing all of this in the house. And the way that it sort of manifests itself is that so many people, especially elders in the Black communities across the United States, they're very hesitant to schedule doctor's appointments. They have a really hard time finding doctors who they believe care about them, really want to listen to them and answer their questions thoughtfully. So they delay getting certain types of care. And then it often means that once they do get care, perhaps their cancer is worse and at a sort of higher stage, or they're at a point of crisis in which they are, instead of being met by sort of therapeutic support, they're going to be criminalized. That happened to members of my father's family, and I write about that in the book as well. And so it really, the issue of trust directly impacts health outcomes. And Madness tells this story, but you really could talk to any clinician and they'll tell you that they see a lot of these patterns showing up in their doctor's offices to this day. And one of the things that was special about writing the book is that actually at one point in the Crownsville story, they end up being able to desegregate the staff, and they're able to hire a lot more Black women and men to work with the Black patients at the hospital. And that's when you start to see a lot of the best new treatments come in and changes happen, when there starts to be more diversity on the staff and patients start to have a lot more trust that the people who are working with them, who are doing their therapy, actually love and care for them. And a lot of the people who I feature in the book, they're nurses and doctors who didn't just look like the patients, but who actually had gone to the same churches, the same schools that their patients attended. And so there's just this level of care. There's this ability to get on the phone and call your mom and know where your family is from, that changed so much for so many of the patients that I met as part of doing this work. And that was really gratifying to see.
And I know that this lack of trust and the lack of care that a lot of Black patients feel manifests itself in many different ways. I mean, there's a Black maternal health crisis where there are disproportionately worse outcomes for Black mothers than there are for their white counterparts. And we, you know, as you pointed out, also with severity of cancer and other life-threatening illnesses. At the same time, we're also seeing the Trump administration is trying to defund medical research under that they call, you know, DEI, which is a lot of important research that they've been doing on people of color and women who were not studied in terms of medical trials very recently even. And so that, you know, in an effort to better treat patients. And so I would imagine that that would just keep this cycle of mistrust and maybe even misdiagnosis and lack of care going when we're even eliminating research at the root problems of some of this.
Oh yeah, I talk to doctors and experts in healthcare policy a lot in connection to this work, and they tell me that's exactly where we are headed right now. And some of them actually believe that part of the purpose of the anti-CRT, anti-DEI movement, it's not just like books on shelves in schools, and I don't want my kid to have to learn about this uncomfortable moment in history, that actually that there is an intentionality, a hope that it will make people of color feel less comfortable connecting with care, less believing in themselves. You know, that the idea is to sort of close down the pipeline of, say, Black women and men coming into certain medical schools and being able to advance in this field so that they can work with those populations in the future. And it was interesting talking to them because it really reframed the way that I covered this as a reporter, because I've covered the anti-DEI, anti-CRT backlash. You mentioned the podcasts that I did at the beginning. That's what those were all about years before Trump 2.0 began. But this movement was bubbling up. And thinking about it from the healthcare perspective really helped me change the way that I saw what it represented. It wasn't just this idea of, oh, America's memory and America's willingness to engage with history, but it was also about people's health, safety, and survival. And when people are excluded from systems, that is a sort of direct threat to their ability to survive, to thrive in this country. And so I think it helped me in talking to them, just ask better questions and think more critically about what goals of the anti-DEI movement actually represent. The other big piece of news that we haven't talked about was, of course, Hegseth's remarks, Secretary of Defense's remarks to the military leaders yesterday. And hearing him, just the way that he talked about people of color, women in service so callously, was hurtful. Again, not from just this sort of basic, like, skin deep investment in wanting to see your military or an arm of your government look like the people that they serve, although certainly I think it's fair for people to hope for that, but also that parts of sort of what he was talking about, for example, it seemed like he was describing that they'll pull back a lot from being so invested in victims of potential abuse or harassment in the military, being able to come forward and make some of their claims. So then when you see this push to keep women out of key roles in the military, again, it's not just about this surface level diversity. It's actually like a threat to women's safety in the military. And so it helped me reframe that issue and the questions that I would have asked if I were able to be in that room very differently. And I think it raises the stakes too of what this represents. It's not just books and faces and places. It's really about people and their well-being and their survival and ability to do well and to succeed in America, and who the sort of American dream is going to be for going forward.
I was really struck by the fact that you were looking at the time period after slavery, when there had been some progress in terms of basic rights for Black Americans in this country, and then the huge backlash during the redemption. And that's when we saw this rise of labeling and stigmatizing Black Americans as being crazy and needing to be locked up. And I actually have done some research, during the Victorian era of women, the first suffrage movement, when a lot of women who were demanding rights were also labeled as crazy, and there were lobotomies and clitoridectomies, and it seems like there is a parallel with when marginalized groups are demanding equality and basic rights, that you see the full weight of institutions, and there's an effort to criminalize or label people as insane. And I was wondering if that was a parallel that you saw with your work as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. And in fact, at the time when I first discovered Crownsville and began my studies as an undergrad at Harvard, I was in a course studying the ways in which the mental health care system, the development of psychiatric drugs, and the messaging around those drugs were used to discredit women who were looking for more equality in their relationships with their partners, trying to get into the workplace, change dynamics in the home in the 50s and 60s in the US. And so gender is another axis on which you can study
Right.
this entire movement. And those dynamics were at play in Crownsville itself as well. And yeah, I think what you see is the use of sort of these professionalized or sort of state or federal government approved systems and processes to spread narratives about and to discredit large groups of people as they come forward and try to ask for change or try to ask for a piece of the sort of American story. And that's happened to people of color. I think that's happening to immigrants right now. I think that is happening to women. And, I often remind people when they're thinking about these moments, when you take just say the Jim Crow moment itself, when these systems of oppression are put into place, it's easy to think of them, I think, on some of these surface level things, like everyone remembers there were separate water fountains. They understand there were separate schools. People couldn't sit in certain parts of buses. But actually, these attitudes, they seeped into everything from people's relationships and women's power in the home or in the workplace, to how a Black person would be treated when they waited in the office of a medical building. Jim Crow and misogyny and sort of institutionalized sexism, they bleed into everything, especially when from the top down, they're the policy and the program. And so I'm concerned now too, as I watch some of what's happening with RFK Jr. And this push around Tylenol. I had a conversation with Dr. Tom Frieden, his former healthcare CDC leader in the US, just the other day on our show, and I was asking him, how concerned is he that as this administration undermines everything from Tylenol to birth control use, that eventually these things won't just be sort of tisk tisk. Women shouldn't do this while pregnant, but
Mm.
actually that they could be used against women, because this is a real question and concern that historians have raised. Could a woman who chooses to use Tylenol in pregnancy be told by someone that they actually are a bad mother, that they have done something harmful to their child? Could that be used against them? We've seen systems of sort of child welfare weaponized against women criminalized for certain behaviors during pregnancy. And so these are, while they may sound very distant or unfamiliar to us, they're things that have happened in other societies and other periods of time. And I think they're real questions we need to ask ourselves, sort of beyond just maybe trying to say they've found the solution for autism, which really no credible medical group believes this administration has. Well, what might be the purpose of sort of finding these different things, and where else might this go? I think reporters, historians, advocates for women do need to start asking very serious questions and trying to protect women and their choices in all of these spaces going forward. Just a lot of this that has rung alarm bells, because if you study history and you see what's happened to women and women and people of color, and pregnant women, especially in some of these conditions, I think we have reason to be a bit concerned about what might happen next. And so I know in my position as a reporter and anchor at MSNBC, I'm going to be keeping a close eye on it.
Right. And we've also seen RFK Jr. Has been very critical of mental health medication, and has made some comments about the fact that he, if it were up to him, a lot of these medications, wouldn't be allowed to be prescribed. And so that, again, could make the mental health crisis even worse, because for a lot of people, that is a critical part of how they've been able to heal, and it's been part of their mental health journey. And there's been a lot of progress on that front in recent years. So that's obviously another dimension of this crisis. I was really struck by the fact that, you go through the history of Crownsville, and, during the 1950s, I think, there were like almost 3,000 people who were living there. But it didn't actually close its doors until 2004. Why did it take that long?
Well, it's I get that question often, and
Mhm.
it's a really interesting one, because on the one hand, I think people imagine that, like, okay, there were these asylums, and then there were these scandals around the asylums. A lot of them got shut down in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So how is it possible that one stayed open until 2004?
Mhm.
Well, it's a very complicated and rich story in a way, because at one point in the sort of mid 20th century and into the 70s and 80s, Crownsville does start to make these incredible strides. They bring on some really talented doctors who are some of the first people to bring in the concept of trauma-informed care, which
Mhm.
maybe sounds obvious to all of us now, but actually was not obvious at one point in the mental health care system, that you should ask a patient about their past, because it might influence their present, and it might be the key to helping them heal. So they were trying out all these new programs. They developed one of the most robust arts programs for patients. So patients could sing, they could dance, they could be part of camping groups. They brought in all this sort of cultural enrichment. And a lot of the hospitals, technically they were seen as better, majority white hospitals in the state, copied a lot of the sort of extracurricular and arts enrichment that Crownsville pioneered. And so in some ways, Crownsville, out of its darkest periods in the early 1900s, ends up in the later 1900s actually being a model, being a place where there was a lot of experimentation and interest in bringing new people, new programs and ideas into the fold. And so in a way, the institution sort of continues to remake and evolve itself. And so it's of value. It goes from being a place that's seen as like this boogeyman and place where you're sent behind doors to never be seen again in the Black community in which it served. But then it becomes a community hospital that people actually really cherish and don't want to see go. There's a sense from many people in the community that if you're Black and you need care, this is literally the only place. So if we lose this, we lose it all. And, you know, there had been the promise of community mental health care, but after JFK's sort of initial push and promise, states often really didn't follow through, and certainly subsequent presidents showed a lot less interest in mental health care than he did. And so that sort of idea of replacing places like Crownsville with clinics really never came to be. So the community held on to this place really, really tight. And so it wasn't until the early 2000s when it simply became an issue of there is no money and the state isn't going to keep paying for this thing, finally, that there's this push to shut it down. And that push was incredibly chaotic. I write at the end of the book about people seeing chairs and documents and x-rays strewn all over the floor. Like, this was not handled in some well-planned, well-maneuvered shutdown. And in fact, the only reason we have the records that tell us the story of Crownsville today is because one employee by the name of Paul Lurs thought to go around by himself and rescue all these records and keep them in a fireproof cabinet and work with a friend of his who worked at the Maryland State Archives to get them preserved. It wasn't a leader, it wasn't the governor of Maryland saying, okay, we're shutting this place down, but we're going to preserve its history and tell its history. That was not the case. It was a random employee deciding that he would take it upon himself to get this done, that we know this story and we're able to piece all of this together now. And so it shuts down in the early 2000s as in this very chaotic way. But one of the things that I think makes it such a special place to tell this story about America is that this history ended up spanning almost 100 years, that it captures all these critical debates in the country around civil rights and who we are, who we're going to be. You can watch sort of the American story unfold through the Crownsville story. And so I think that's why the book has received the response that it has. I still get emails every day from readers. I was at a book event last night and a reader came up to me. He was the last reader in line, and he gave me a picture of his great-grandfather and a copy of his great-grandfather's death certificate. And he had died at Crownsville, and he had, you know, really never heard many stories about his great-grandfather, didn't have much information, but he felt like my book was a way for him to understand his great-grandfather and to sort of understand the last place in which he lived. So it was such a reminder for me of the power of history to help people feel whole, to help them understand parts of themselves they can't access. And so, you know, it is always strange to me that it closed in 2004, because that I think that idea feels so foreign, but it also, the fact that this place survived in that way for so long actually means that it has this rich, incredible history, these people who worked there who are still alive. There are all these pieces there that made this story possible to tell that wouldn't be the case at an equivalent institution in another state. And there were many of them. There were Crownsvilles in almost every state. Most of them, though, have just disappeared. And so this place was both unique in all those aspects, but also so typical of the American story. And I think that's what makes the book, the stories told in it, really special.
That's really powerful for you to, you know, have someone come up to you whose you know, relative was there, and it's such a testament to, you know, the power of telling these stories that haven't been told. And I know that's the approach that you take as well as a journalist, and it's something we definitely need more of. So I appreciate you coming here and talking with us about your book. Let's go ahead and put that up one more time. It's Madness, and you can get that now on paperback anywhere that you buy books. Antonia, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Of course, Susan, this was so lovely. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, everyone.